Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our podcast today is brought to you by the University of Hong Kong's RegTech Lab, the HKU Standard Chartered Foundation FinTech Academy, the Asia Global Institute, the HKU edX Professional Certificate in FinTech, along with support from the university's Faculty of Law. Today's topic is a little less savory than what we're used to discussing, as we're going to delve into Web3, artificial intelligence fakes, and the dreaded topic of sextortion online. It's all too often the case that people take things more seriously when they hit close to home. Issues take on a more pronounced, visceral shape. Such was the case with our returning guest, Oonagh of Royal Compliance, as she can recount, while working on an awareness campaign, her own 13-year-old daughter, along with a few of her school friends, became the victims of blackmail because of some innocent photos shared on Snapchat. Raising awareness, Oonagh says, can help prevent others from experiencing the same thing. A recent report from Europol reveals that cybercriminals are increasingly exploiting new technologies to commit complex and dangerous crimes. Large language models, for example, or LLM, malicious LLM is being used to develop scripts, phishing emails, and online fraud advertisements to overcome language barriers that allow sex offenders to groom victims in any language and impersonate their peers in some cases. Then there's generative AI, specifically the creation of AI-altered and fully artificial child sexual abuse materials that are so believable and used in sextortion cases that it makes it harder for law enforcement to identify victims and find the right legal framework to bring charges. There's also the issue of deepfakes. Increasingly sophisticated and accessible deepfakes have caused a problem for law enforcement, and the authorities have started to use more advanced detection tools as a response. Oonagh's firm, Raw Compliance, has been working on some important awareness videos about social media scams and sextortion targeting preteens, teenagers, and young adults. As the founder of the compliance consultancy and training firm, Raw Compliance, Oonagh grew up in Northern Ireland during the tumultuous 1980s. She's a compliance industry veteran, a lawyer by training, and an entrepreneur by vocation. Having grown up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, she went on to become a lawyer, compliance officer, recruiter, and later a consultant and educator. And with that, Oonagh, thank you so much for joining us.
AJ, thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute privilege to join you once again.
Well, I wish we were talking about a happier topic, but I mean, if I look at your LinkedIn post today, said that you were breaking new ground by collaborating with the infamous Nick Leeson of Barrings fame to combine your expertise to make a tangible difference in the fight against financial scams and online fraud. I quote, "Banks are not doing enough to help victims of financial scams, largely due to shortcomings in their technology and fraud detection systems. In the UK, financial crime is growing as an issue with over 3.5 million people affected by scams annually, leading to losses exceeding £1.2 billion. In Europe, the problem is equally severe, with countries like Ireland and the Netherlands reporting significant increases in scam-related incidents, resulting in hundreds of millions of euros in losses. And in the US, it's costing consumers over $3.3 billion annually, and you say your mission's to offer unwavering support and practical solutions to those affected. I guess, I mean, it's kind of related to what we're discussing, but I mean, if we focus on the matter at hand, I mean, how what can be done to prevent it? I mean, how can financial institutions navigate the evolving regulations and effectively monitor for child sexual abuse materials, or CSAM is the
Yeah.
acronym. What can they do?
Well, first things, you said it would be better, it would be nicer if we're talking about a kind of a better subject. But in fact, any opportunity to raise awareness is a wonderful opportunity. And that's really where we need to start. There's an absolute lack of awareness, of understanding of the modern day financial scams. And one of the biggest challenges, AJ, is the people that we're seeing that are victims, they're not uneducated. These are incredibly intelligent people that have done their homework. It's not as if they're going to hand over, and in some instances, hundreds of thousands, if not a few million, to people that they haven't actually done their homework on. But what we're finding is the level of psychological manipulation, the level of sophistication of the scammers, and we'll talk in a minute about deep fake, etc. It is at a level that is unprecedented. As you mentioned, in the US alone, we're talking on an annual basis 3.3 billion. Like these statistics are incredibly insane. And it kind of begs the question, how has this pandemic, because this is what it is, been allowed to become so exasperated that we're at a point now where the numbers are just beyond our comprehension? The first things first, as I said, is awareness. There's an absolute lack of awareness. I actually watched a movie there at the weekend called Thelma. I don't know if you've come across it, and it's a new movie just out about a 93-year-old woman that was scammed in the US. And she took it upon herself to track down the perpetrator. It's a brilliant movie. It's definitely worth a watch. But the point is that people, she got a phone call supposedly from her grandson, using technology that had obviously altered the voice, saying that he had been picked up by the police because he'd been involved in a car accident, and that she needed to send money. She was going to get a phone call very soon after his call, and she needed to send money to get him out of prison or get him out, on bail. So she then immediately got the phone call. She wrote down the details, and then she proceeded to send the money. She wasn't able to get in touch with anyone who could help her to understand this was a scam. And so that's just a movie. But interestingly, last night I was out for dinner, and interestingly, there was somebody that was sitting at the table next to us who was also from Northern Ireland. So we started chatting, and it was an older couple, and they were actually talking about one of the gentlemen, his mother had been scammed, had been sent an email and had been asked to go around and buy in the US and buy vouchers from Target. And we see this quite a lot, asked go and buy some, cards for Target, Apple, all of these, Amazon. So these cards that have the money within the card. And this is happening over and over again. And when they heard this, they actually phoned round all of the Target stores that were in the proximity of the gentleman's mother to say, if this lady comes in, do not sell her these cards because she's being scammed. So it goes back to kind of the original point that I made. It's all about awareness, and it is being done so simply. And that's the worst thing nowadays, AJ. When we look at previous financial scams, in typologies, they were much more sophisticated. But what scammers have now realized is, hey, we don't need to be sophisticated. It's literally just about finding the right victim and bleeding them dry. That's basically what they're doing. So there's many different types of typologies we've seen: romance scams, pig butchering, sextortion, which is one of the worst. And sextortion is targeting predominantly 13 to 17-year-old boys. And in fact, and what's happening here is, because of the absolute humiliation, i.e., these boys have been tricked into sending, indecent pictures themselves to a third party. What's subsequently happening is that they are then blackmailed by this other person who is, let's say it's pretending to be this lady called Jessica, where in fact it's not Jessica. It is mostly it's around the age of 30-year-old men, based in predominantly, we're seeing Ivory Coast, Myanmar, Thailand, and we'll talk a bit more about the kind of the pig butchering complexes as well that are being set up over there. And these individuals, some of them are then ultimately committing suicide. We're talking about teenage boys because of how embarrassed they are and the threatening behavior. Now, these blackmailers are saying, we have access to your telephone, we have access to all of your contacts, whether that's true or not. Again, awareness. What is the capabilities of a third party to access all of the information within your telephone unless you've given them access permissions and they've been able to get into your phone or into your laptop? So it's about understanding technology. It's about understanding who you're dealing with. But as I said as well at the beginning, the level of sophistication. And when I say sophistication, for example, on the romance scams or indeed trading scams, they're setting up fake trading platforms. So when you're putting the money in and they're saying, oh, you're going to get this guaranteed return, you're actually seeing the platform, your money going in, and you're seeing the increment in the monies that you're making. And, as I said, this looks logical, this looks above board, but the simple thing, if these individuals ran internet searches on even just pictures of individuals they've received, they would find that those pictures are freely available across the internet. So again, awareness, education, training. And then I'm happy as well, AJ, to go in to the specifics about each typology of each of the crimes, and what that looks like, and also statistically what the impact is that we're seeing today.
This is the sort of thing that people need to know. So yeah, anything you can do to impart to them what they need to be wary of. I mean, forewarned is forearmed.
So, as you mentioned, I have the absolute privilege of joining forces with the infamous Nick Leeson. I've known Nick for a few years now. I suppose I can't really go into the details. He's better to speak to historically to his position. But, he was a 25-year-old guy, you know, in Barrings, at that time. And, if you look back, one of the things that he says about then and now, and he talks a lot about compliance in a lot of the public speaking and keynote speeches that he does, the systems and controls haven't really developed in terms of their sophistication to prevent any type of illicit activity from happening. Yes, what we've seen over the years, whether you look at the Barrings example, UBS, SocGen, Jerome Creval, any of these situations, what we saw was that people having access rights to back office and front office systems. And obviously, we now know that there's a lot to do with segregation of duties, segregation of, having a 4-eye principle, making sure that not one person can, authorize transactions within a system. But what we've now found, in particular in the compliance and the control space, is there hasn't been an evolution in terms of sophistication of controls, which is something that concerns us all. And why do I say it concerns us all? Going back to these crimes, let's take, for example, AJ, you use your bank account day to day for living expenses. So you pay your bills, you go to Fusion, do some shopping, just day to day, buying lunch, traveling around in taxis, paying for petrol with your car, simple stuff. And then suddenly on your bank account, you see a number of transactions that are increasing in value over a sequential number of days, talking like, 3,000, then 10,000, then 20,000, then 100,000. And then what we're also seeing is we're seeing same day in and out transfers of quite large sums. We see liquidation of pension funds. We see homes being remortgaged. We see, for example, a car being sold. You have to ask yourself, how has the bank's fraud controls, that's that stops the transaction before it goes out, or indeed the transaction monitoring controls not picked up a sudden erratic change in the customer's, i.e., your bank account. And the question begs itself, in many instances, people are being scammed because, through no fault of their own, they have been manipulated. Some of them are being, acting under duress. But why hasn't the bank identified through fraud controls and through transaction monitoring controls that there's a sudden change in an account, which is a massive indicator of fraud? And the truth of the matter is, AJ, banks do not have the controls in place to identify because we're still using legacy, outdated systems, which, unless we implement AI technology across the bank into various areas, we are not going to immediately identify these types of changes in profiles. And that is incredibly concerning because that means that your bank account at any point in time, without you even realizing, could even be used by money mules. And yet nobody, unless you've looked at your bank account and looked at, and in most cases, it's very small amounts coming in and out of your account in the money mule situations. As I said, very, very simple. You've given your bank account details to someone, and I'll talk again how that simply happens. And they're processing through, $200-300 at a time transactions, and I mean US dollars through your account. You're not really going to notice that. The bank's not going to notice that. But guess what? Your bank is now being used as a conduit for financial crime. And should this be picked up, unfortunately, you're the one who will be liable because it was your bank account. Even though you weren't aware of it, you are now complicit to a financial crime. So this is what's happening. And I'm not saying that the banks need themselves to, make sure that clients and customers are making the right investment decisions for themselves. And they don't need to, obviously, Big Brother is watching you, micromanage who you're transferring monies to. But if we go back to the basics of KYC, what we're trying to understand is the profile of our customer, who they're going to be interacting with, what types of volumes should we expect to see in and out of the account, which type of third parties should we expect to see our customers interacting with, and what should those volumes look like? If we then begin to start seeing erratic activity, especially with older customers who have been with the bank 20, 30, 40 years, we have 40 years worth of data of how that account is actually used. So let's be honest, a sudden change in those accounts is and does necessitate an immediate escalation, but it's not happening. And when people then reach out to their banks and say, hi, I've become a victim of a financial scam, the response from the bank is, hey, we can't be liable for your investment decisions. That's absolutely correct. They cannot. What they are, however, liable for is it's a very clear regulatory environment. They need to have fraud controls and they need to have transaction monitoring controls. And what we know is that current transaction monitoring systems are somewhere between 2 to 8% accurate, which is absolutely shockingly bad. The rest of those 92% of alerts are false positives. We have complex, money laundering networks operating through some of the largest banks globally, undetected because the systems are not sophisticated enough to identify it, because current transaction monitoring systems are rules-based and scenario-based. So when you have embedded complex networks, you're never going to see it. That's complex networks. We're talking here about basic changes and significant changes in day-to-day usage of vulnerable customers' accounts. Vulnerable customers who are supposed to be protected. And the banks are wiping their hands clean and saying, it's not our problem. But in fact, it is their problem, because unless they can actually clearly show that they had in place controls to identify fraudulent activity, to identify sudden changes that should have required them to immediately stop the payments because of their regulatory obligations and their duty of care to the customer, it then becomes the bank's problem. So this is one of the things that we're really passionate about at Funds Rehab, because the banks are trying to say, we can't help you, it's not our problem. And the point is, the bank has failed in their duty of care to these customers and failed to protect them. And we need the banks to now start stepping up, being responsible for their regulatory obligations and protecting vulnerable people, which in my opinion, and based on what I have seen to date with a number of individuals I've worked with, they are not being protected. And some of these individuals are so embarrassed by what's happened. As I mentioned, these are sophisticated, intelligent people. And in some instances, before we've been able to support them, before they've come to us, these individuals have taken their own lives as well. So what we really want to do here is working together with Nick, in his knowledge of banks, again, my knowledge, 20 plus years working in the regulatory environment, coming together in particular to raise awareness, but also to try and help to get recourse, and also at the same time to put the banks on notice that they need to implement better technology in order to support and protect not just the financial integrity of our markets, but also to protect the customers who are, in essence, paying for them to exist. And at the moment, they're not doing that. So that's where we really want to make a difference. We want to pay it forward, and we want to help people who've lost their life savings to be able to either stay in retirement, because some of them are in retirement and have lost everything, and some of these victims are just about to go into retirement and they've lost everything. So we're just trying to get people back on an even keel and try and see what we can do to affect real change in the banking sector. Interestingly, the one regulated location that we're seeing real change in this area is Australia. Westpac in particular, recently, they've actually, even some of their customers have been publicly speaking about how impressed they've been. Some of them thought we'd lost everything, but the bank had actually stopped the payments. And in fact, the CEO in Australia has been doing some posts, like not today scammers, just to show that their controls are working. But we're not seeing that in other locations. We're not seeing it in Hong Kong. We're not seeing it in the UK. We're not seeing it in the US. And why not? Why are banks not implementing these systems? Is it the cost? Is it the challenge with legacy systems, which, if we want to go into detail about AI implementation, that is a massive issue. The other big issue, AJ, is data pools or data lakes, or as I like to call them, sewage pits of data. The banks cannot implement these systems until they clean up data. And the problem they have is they, especially over the years, with numerous acquisitions of whether it's systems or indeed other entities within the entity, they have multiple systems with multiple sources of the truth. The data is more of a sewage pit than anything, and they have to clean up that. It's like cleaning up the Seine for the Olympics. Even after spending €1 billion, nobody wanted to do a triathlon and swim in it, and I'm not surprised. But the problem is in the banks, they're unwilling to put the money investing in cleaning up these data lakes and our data sewage pits. Why? Well, where is the regulatory need to do it? They have other enforcement actions. They've other pressing areas that they need to invest that money. Digitalization, catching up with fintechs, being able to keep, traditional TradeFi, being able to keep up with fintechs and an evolving financial landscape, how we bank, how we work, everything is changing. So their money is being spent in other areas of digitalization at the front end. But if you look at the back end, it's still a hamster running in a wheel. It is so old-fashioned. The banks are investing money in updating the front end, digitalization, you have apps, etc. It all looks more kind of advanced. It all looks, if I may say, in inverted commas, sexier. But the truth is, the back end is still the same old legacy systems, the data sewage pits that we're seeing, multiple sources of the truth. This when we go back to basics, what we're talking about in terms of identification of financial scams, all of this data in terms of profiling for customers, it's in their systems, but it's in different systems. And they're not profiling their customers. And it's the only way going forward that we're going to be able to better identify fraudulent activity on accounts. But what worries us and what we're seeing is that the banks, when you've banked for 20, 30, 40 years with your bank, and suddenly there's an erratic change in your account activity, you kind of would expect that the bank would pick this up, but they're not. And then when you go to the bank and say, hey, wait a second, their attitude is, it's not our problem, it's yours. You authorize the payment, not us. So, what we're finding is people don't know their rights. They don't understand what the obligations of the bank is in respect of regulatory requirements. And, if we don't get recourse for our customers through the banks, we will get recourse through the regulators by escalating this and going to the respective regulators around the globe and trying to understand why the banks aren't doing more to implement and comply with their regulatory requirements, which are having adequate fraud systems, which are having adequate transaction monitoring systems. So what we're trying to do here is really affect positive change that's going to protect everybody in the financial industry. And we need, and whether this requires us to do massive publicity campaigns, we cannot have people dying because they've lost money, which could have been prevented had the banks carried out and complied with their regulatory duty.
You know, it's interesting to hear you say that on the back end it's being held together by string, because I mean this is something Robin Lee, our mutual friend, said to me more than 10 years ago, that big banks in this town, as of that time, I don't know how bad the situation is now. You would seem to suggest that things haven't changed that much. As of that time, they were hiring computer programmers in their 60s and 70s because no one else remembered those antiquated programming languages, BASIC, COBOL, Fortran, and whatever else they were using.
Yeah.
So he said on the front end, it may look aesthetically pleasing, but just know that it's all predicated on a very weak, older, unwieldy system, and it's unclear when that's going to collapse.
So you're absolutely right. Some banks are running on their core banking systems on code that is 30 plus years old. And you're absolutely right what Robin said. In fact, I've had that same discussion with him, and he was telling me as well about, them having to bring in retirees in various banks to help with implementation of new systems because the code was so old. HSBC, however, is one of the success stories of AI implementation in the transaction monitoring space. They actually teamed up with Google AI, and they went to Google, and this is out in the public domain, and they went to Google and they said, look, this is our problem statement. Our transaction monitoring system, as we know, as the market knows, the systems just don't do what they say on the tin. This is our kind of geographic, footprint. This is the type of customers we have. This is the type of products we have. End of. They didn't tell the tool what to look for. They didn't say to the tool, you need to find XYZ. They left the tool to learn for itself and then to come back with its findings. And what that tool found was complex networks in the book that they didn't even know existed. And they've publicly talked about this. It's brilliant because no human being even, would be able to identify this, because of the data requirements in order to analyze this and the sophistication of these networks is beyond anything you can ever imagine. And remember, all of these networks, the more sophisticated ones, these guys have a termination button. The minute that they believe they've been identified, they cut off immediately that typology and they move to the next. Every one of them has a plan B, C, and D in place because this is sophisticated money laundering. And on many occasions, and this, by the way, I'm not saying this about HSBC, but generally the more complex is also involving sanction evasion as well. But again, if we look now at typologies for sanction evasion, in particular, for example, Russian sanction evasion, it's through multiple front companies and individuals in order to, guise over who are the benefactors and who is the originator. So again, AI is the only way that we're going to be able to solve this problem. But as you rightly said, implementing these systems, it sounds simple enough for me to say, hey, go out and get an AI tool. But it's not that simple. As you rightly said, there's legacy systems. If you're trying to implement modern AI and do, API with the 30-plus-year-old code, it's not going to work. It doesn't, they're completely incompatible. So you're having to change the entire central coding of the bank system before and update that before you can move forward. And that is a multi-million-dollar exercise. And in some instances, in order to do that, you would need to shut down some of the bank's controls, or say controls, some of the bank's systems temporarily. And I say temporarily, maybe for a few hours, maybe for a day, in order to allow the transition. And the challenge is banks can't do that because they would lose millions doing that. So we're in a very difficult predicament that we know as an industry, our technology is outdated. TradeFi is falling behind. We know that the fintechs and the crypto firms are moving forward with a lot more advanced technology at their disposal. And the question is, so we've got challenges with digitalization. We've got challenges with TradeFi keeping customers because it's easier to do business with the fintechs. And again, if we look at Gen Z, et cetera, people just want ease of usage. But then the next step is, in order for TradeFis to compete, there is a massive, massive cleanup exercise and a multi-million-dollar exercise to be undertaken to recalibrate systems, to update code, to basically understand before we can even look at AI. And I talked about, the data cleanup. You also need to go through your systems. Like, what are all your systems doing? Do you understand all the different systems you have? Many banks don't, as I mentioned, because of legacy reasons. Again, a lot of banks implement, let's be perfectly honest. When it comes to remediation action of audit or regulatory findings, we see a lot of plasters being put in place. And what do I mean by that? If there's a crack in the wall, you plaster over the crack. When another crack appears, another regulatory finding, another enforcement action, we plaster over the gap. And in some instances, the fixes there are just, how can I say it? They are nothing more than cosmetic fixes because the problem is the foundation's broken. We need to go back to basics on the controls. But we're not doing that because that will delay the closure timeline of audit findings or regulatory findings. And so what we're finding time and time again is because of KPIs, key performance indicators, people are choosing to plaster over cracks in the wall because fixing the foundation is not their problem. They're not accountable for that. So what we've ended up with is those plasters being multiple different systems that potentially have similar use cases. In fact, we could use existing systems, but people aren't exploring that because they want quick fixes. So we've ended up with an absolute minefield of systems and controls, all topped on top of each other, all operating on a siloed basis. Risk controls have been over-engineered within an inch of their lives. And what's happened? Well, we're not mitigating risk. We're basically just giving airtime that we closed audit findings, that we closed enforcement action findings. But what's it done internally to organizations? It has made controls so siloed that the operational risk department no longer talks to the compliance department, who don't talk to the credit risk department. And and even within the compliance department, the financial crime team, the sanctions team, the regulatory compliance team may not even be speaking on a day-to-day basis. It's an absolute shambles, AJ. It's an absolute shambles. And unless something serious happens with the regulators saying enough is enough, this is not going to clean itself up. And again, I'm not saying that Nick and I are out there and we're going to be able to make and affect this real change, but Nick has been saying for years, the controls are not adequate to mitigate the risk or to identify the risks. And we're not, every financial activity carries risk. Every financial product has risk. We work in an industry of risk. We cannot remove risk, but we can mitigate risk within our appetite for risk and for risk occurring. But at the moment, it's just an absolute, I hate to say the expression, but there's no other expression for it. It's a complete shit show. You can edit that out if you wish, but it's a mess. And when we see remediation action, we're seeing the same thing. It's like Einstein said, to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result is insanity. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing. Consultancy firms regurgitating enforcement action or remediation action. That's great, but doesn't fix the problem. So the question is, we came on to talk about AI, to talk about scams, but at the heart of this is the fact that many of these victims, and they are victims, could be protected if the banks would just get their acts together and have in place adequate controls to quickly identify changes in the client's accounts so the client can maybe mitigate and minimize their losses. That's all we're asking for.
You've placed a great deal of emphasis on controls, as has Nick. Um, is it fair to say then that because both you and he believe that not much has changed since 95, and I remember that time well. I mean, when the story broke, I was sitting in a banker's office in Sok Jen in Harbor City and in Chim Sao Choi, and that was the bulk of our conversation. We talked more about that than what I originally came to see her about, but that was that was the crux of it. That the point was that Barrings had to know what he was up to, and Nick Leeson even said to me when I spoke to him, yeah, his higher ups were not blind. They were not so blind as to what he was doing. Therefore, folks further up in the hierarchy are complicit. But coming back to your point about controls, then, if not that much has changed, then is it fair to say that these scandals of the past are capable of being repeated?
Oh, yeah, totally. And we've actually even seen it this past couple of weeks. We've seen two cases in the UK, one with Barclays and one with Lloyds, where an IT worker in Lloyds Bank in the UK was able to access customer accounts and then basically started scamming customers out of money. We saw another situation there with Barclays just yesterday in the press. Again, an individual in the bank was accessing dormant accounts and siphoning money out of them. This is 101. Like this dormant account protections. Come on. This is the year 2020, where are we, 2024? I remember 20 years ago when I started out, dormant accounts was one of the first things that we looked at because we were doing, whether it's MiFID controls implementation in 2007, we were looking at all of these aspects of controls within the organization. And, I cannot believe that 20 years, approximately 20 years later, it's still the same thing. And it begs the question, what's changed? And this is the point. Many times these incidents occur and they never make it to the press because they're brushed under the carpet, or the individual, no legal action is taken because the bank doesn't want to, is it worth trying to reclaim the monies? Is it worth the publicity? So these things are happening. But I'm just shocked that even in the press this week, it's 101 basics. So yeah, have things changed? Well, the enforcement actions, the typologies aren't changing. We're still seeing, and the only times that controls seem to improve momentarily is when enforcement action happens, but then they become lax again afterwards. But ways in which controls are implemented as well can be quite idiotic. Many years ago, when I was in one bank I was working with, again, I can't go into details about the specific organization, but an individual in the bank during an office move transpired that they'd actually taken home one of the bank's computers. So we're not talking like a laptop, we're talking like, old school desktop. How in fact was that possible to happen? Where was the reconciliation on the IT side of all of the systems that were moving between the offices? How much office furniture does go missing whenever you're moving between offices? You could laugh about it. But the truth is, those computers, especially back in those days, contained sensitive customer data. And somebody was able just to take it home. They weren't using it for illicit purposes. They just needed a computer at home. But this only came to light because of another situation that had arisen. And whenever being interviewed, the individual thought that the fact that they'd taken the computer had been identified, but in fact, what had been identified was something a little bit more serious. And that's the important point. And again, this is a completely separate discussion on kind of integrity in bank employees, but you have to remember that when a bank employee begins to identify that when they do something wrong and it doesn't get escalated and credible deterrent is not implemented, that's the start of it. And that's where these issues begin to get exasperated. So, if we look at the Lloyd's example or the Barclays example, this guy stole over £75,000 to basically fund his girlfriends and his lavish lifestyle. How was it identified? Through social media posts, because his girlfriend was posting about going on holidays to, I don't know, Mauritius or the Maldives, etc. Her new Louis Vuitton handbag, her Christian Louboutin shoes. Again, it was identified because of social media posts. It wasn't identified because of the bank's controls. So what does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that the financial criminals, such as they are, realize that there's a good chance they won't get caught, or it'll be a long time coming, and hence they're that much more brazen that they blithely talk about, pig butchering, which is a distasteful term, but that's how they see their victims is the flock being led to slaughter. And
yeah, exactly. It's just beefing them up to slaughter them. It's like the Christmas turkey. You're feeding it to kill it at Christmas, and that's what pig butchering is. The victim is the pig, and the butchering is when they absolutely decimate them by taking their money. And what they're doing is they're building relationships. It could even be just that somebody's lonely and they need a friend. There's a really, really great. Again, maybe I watch too many movies. I like to have the TV on when I'm working. I'm one of those people. But the other movie that I watched recently that was really impactful in this regard was one called The Beekeeper with Jason Statham. And I didn't just watch it because Jason Statham was in it. Well, I kind of did. But his movies are always pretty good, except for that one with the big shark. But one of the things that I was really impressed with this movie is this movie went through the typologies of a vulnerable older lady being scammed. And she was managing the account for a charity, and somebody contacted her to say that her spyware needed to be updated on her computer. And then she gave them access to her computer. And then what they did was they immediately removed all of the monies from her accounts because they were able to access all of her online banking. And subsequently, when she realized this had happened, she took her own life. And Jason Statham in this movie was this previous, as he always is, a previous kind of elite force guy. So he took it upon himself to basically track down these guys. And what you will see in the movie, and it's a little bit, I suppose, Hollywood style, but he manages to track down the boiler room where all of these guys are working in this boiler room. And, it's just incredible. It's incredible when you see the sophistication of it. You have this one guy going around going, come on, let's see how much more money we can make. And then people celebrating, oh, I just made 20K or I made 30K. And you have the number up in the screen at the front of the room, kind of like if you had like a telethon, like charity event, and you see the numbers on the screen. It's like every time somebody donates. And that's what you were seeing in this boiler room happening, and people were high-fiving and celebrating.
Every time someone makes a sale or makes a con.
Exactly. Ring that bell, whoa, we made some money. But, they're so far removed from the victim, psychology that they're seeing this as a business. And so these people are sitting there and they're like, yeah, I'm making this money. But what they're not seeing is the human consequence at the end of it. But as I said, that's a Hollywood version of it. In reality, pig butchering is a very good example in this. During COVID, And you should see some of the aerial footage on this, AJ. It's pretty shocking. There's these compounds on the border of Thailand and Myanmar. And, kind of, we look about 2 or 3 years ago, these compounds were just like small, one or two kind of, you know, metal shacks, can you say sheds? Nowadays, these are sophisticated, built up compounds that are housing, hundreds, if not a couple of thousand people at a time. You should, I'll send you over some of the aerial pictures. It's absolutely shocking. And what's happening in these compounds is people are being recruited, and I say that in inverted commas, to perpetrate these crimes. When I
Oh,
say
there's
in
clearly
inverted
a human
commas,
trafficking element to this as well.
exactly. And that's when I said about recruitment in inverted commas. The human trafficking element here is shockingly bad. So, what we have seen is in some instances, people have seen job advertisements with the likes of EY, the big four. I'm not calling out EY in particular, but we're seeing this typology. Job interviews or a guaranteed job with these companies. They're then sent the money for their travel expenses. So they're coming from different locations. But the most important thing is that they have, they're fluently able to speak English. So what's happening is they're doing all of these, they do these interviews, everything. You've got the job. There'll be a driver waiting for you in Bangkok at the airport. So these guys, they arrive, they get sent, let's say, 5,000 US dollars to cover their travel expenses, and it's all nice. And they're going to be taken to their new apartment and everything. They get to the airport, the driver is waiting with the sign, they get in the car, they're driven around for about 4 hours, completely distorting their perception of where they are, which is probably quite easy in Bangkok with all the traffic. And then the car pulls up at the side of a river, and the people get out. They're like, "What is this?" They say, "Get in the boat." They're like, "No." Well, if you don't get in the boat, we'll kill you here, and who's going to find you? So these people are being trafficked. They're going there with the understanding that they're going for a real job. They're then trafficked. They're brought to these compounds. In these compounds, they're tortured, they're chained, they're electrocuted. There's various methods of psychological kind of warfare at play, and they're forced to commit these scams. And, it's only whenever then somebody realizes that these people are missing that they then need to try and figure out where they are. And this is where, AJ, the big challenge is, because international cooperation, the Thai authorities need evidence that there has been a crime to be able to go into the compound, because it's private property. So they need, should I say, collaboration with other enforcement parties around the globe. And these aren't cases that you can solve overnight. So what's happening is a lot of charities are now getting involved to try and help get these people out and smuggle them out of the compounds. And it's an absolute disaster. And as you said, the human trafficking element here is significant. So whenever people, you watch, that's why I mentioned this Hollywood movie, these people, and they're like all high-fiving. In these compounds, in reality, these people, many of them are not doing this through choices. Some of them will be, of course, but many of them are actually trafficked, and they're there through no choice of their own, perpetrating these crimes, and they have to meet daily KPIs. Otherwise, the consequences can be terrible. So when we're talking about these crimes that are horrendous in terms of the victim and the consequences, and in some instances, I've mentioned people taking their own lives, at the background, we've also got crimes happening. And this is where it's just a really, really sad state of affairs in terms of where we are today. Crimes are being committed in countries where and across borders, which is impacting the ability of local enforcement to take action, because the Thai authorities have said, "Hey, wait a second, there's no crimes happening in Thailand. We've got no evidence of people being kidnapped, of human trafficking, and the crimes that are happening against the victims are in Europe or in the US. So what do you want us to do?" Or in Hong Kong or Singapore, "What do you want us to do about it? It's not happening in Thailand." So you've got this really big challenge on our hands at the moment. It's like, okay, so we can educate, we can help raise awareness, But going back to it, is the one party in all of this that owes a duty of care to somebody and that has failed in their duty of care is the bank. And I'm not saying that all of the losses the bank needs to be liable for. That's not at all. If the bank has implemented controls and has asked the right questions, they're doing their job. But when the account is blatantly being used for this type of scan, the bank has permitted, and I say permitted because they failed to identify it, they have permitted illicit activity to happen on their own books. And what does that? Well, let's look at the case of Binance. CZ went to jail because they were able to identify KYC and sanction shortcomings. Well, what other CEO has ever been put in jail for that reason? And I also beg the question, if any other organization had a year's worth of resources dedicated to them, we would find in every single financial institution illicit activity happening in their books, because it is happening in all financial institutions' books, and we would be foolish to think otherwise. So my question is, given the enforcement action that was taken against Binance, can we now say, because we can see it black and white, that enforcement action should now be taken across TradeFi, across the traditional banks in a similar nature, because they are, in essence, allowing and to an extent facilitating money laundering and illicit activity because they're failing to implement adequate controls, which they have a regulatory obligation to have in place? And I know that's a very contentious question, but it's the question that needs to be asked.
Well, the banks are part of the establishment, right? The oldest banks on earth. I mean, they're part of the establishment. They're part of the ruling class. I mean, I recall years ago, someone from the JFIU in London was giving a talk before a group of bankers, and someone approached him, an older banker, very gentlemanly, three-piece suit, old, old world type, approached him and he said, you've succinctly described the problem, and rather accurately, but I can assure you that not one member of my class will be held accountable for any of it. Now, some might take that as a subversive statement if that conversation actually went down as he described to me. But on another level, it's more a recognition of the way things are, that there are some people that are just, maybe not too big to fail, but too far up the pecking order, too far up the totem pole to get at, to reach. That the long arm of the law only extends as far as it can be enforced. And all too often, when you look at scandals in the financial sector, it's the folks lower down in the hierarchy. It's the underlings that execute, because the chain of causation, the chain of responsibility, the further up you go, the more diffuse it becomes, the more opaque it becomes. And maybe that's testament to the fact that the people higher up, they're smart enough to not leave a paper trail, that they have enough plausible deniability to say, I wasn't aware of it. Kind of like with The Sopranos, the crime show, that you wouldn't go to Tony Soprano and tell him what you wanted. You went to his right-hand man, to his consigliere, who would then tell Tony Soprano what you wanted. And that way, there was a distance, there was a gap, that there was some...
There's deniability. You have to remember as well is that a lot of the enforcement action that we've seen to date in banks, as you rightly said, it doesn't go against the top. It goes against LIBOR is a perfect example. Like, who did we see in LIBOR being sent to prison? It was the lowest pecking order. It was, and let's be honest, LIBOR it's really, really important to talk about it. These guys were doing something that had been recognized and was known by the British Banking Association and the FSA at the time, and now the FCA. They had known about this for years. You know, this was common practice. And then one day somebody decided, oh, let's take enforcement action, various reasons and, for why that happened. And who went to jail? Well, these traders, they were taught what to do by their superiors because their superiors did that. And it was known as a standard practice within the industry. But who went to jail? It was the juniors, the office juniors. But everybody was doing it. That's what, and you go to, deniability, there will be that element of, look, I'm going to be in this position for, X number of years. I want to be able to show the profits. I want to be able to show the returns. I'm willing to turn a blind eye as long as I don't know too much about it to X, Y, Z. But if you get caught, you're on your own. But in the case of LIBOR, that wasn't the case. Everybody knew what was happening. But, and the banking, the BBA knew, the FSA at the time, they knew. But yeah, what happened? Well, what happened afterwards was that the FSA was dissembled and, the prudential standards went to the Bank of England and the FSA was rebranded as the Conduct Authority. And so they focused more on kind of regulation and conduct, and all prudential aspects went to the Bank of England. Okay, that's great. So we've reorganized, we've restructured, but it doesn't exactly set the right culture or the right tone, because the truth is, if you look at accountability, the right people weren't made accountable. And this is a whole other discussion on accountability. Do accountability regimes work? Do we actually see the right people paying the price for wrongdoings? The only time categorically we can say that the tone was set correctly in terms of accountability was in the case of Binance. They're the only ones that have been kind of held out to dry. But the truth is, there are many other reasons for that, which we don't have probably long enough today to go into. But, Binance created and CZ created an incredible monopoly, an incredible platform that was diversifying, products faster than any other crypto platform or indeed TradeFi could keep up. That needed to be put in its place. So to give TradeFi an opportunity to kind of catch up if it ever can, but also the monopoly needs to be broken down. It's a bit like why Meta never got their banking license, because you couldn't have a bank that suddenly already has, 1 billion customers. This wouldn't be allowed. It's a monopoly in itself. So you have to look at the reasons why enforcement actions are not being taken properly. And again, we all, the writing's there. And I don't want to be one of these people that wants to put the world to right. I'm not trying to change the culture of the entire banking system. But when it comes back to financial scams and it comes back to everyday people being affected, you, me, our children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, being affected by scams, losing their life savings through these very, sometimes unsophisticated, sometimes sophisticated scams, are bank accounts becoming conduits for money laundering, unknown to us, but yet when identified, we actually could be convicted as being complacent in it. Hey, Jay, where's the protection for individuals? Who is protecting the man on the street? Who is protecting the customers? And this is what it goes back to with funds rehab. The bank has a duty of care. And if we can evidence that the bank has failed in their duty of care, they then need to work and to compensate the customer. And unless the bank can prove that their fraud controls worked and their transaction monitoring controls worked, then they, do they really have a leg to stand on? So that's kind of where we are. But it's the typology, as I said, in some instances, the typologies are really simple. And that's why money launderers don't need, to engineer complexity nowadays, because in essence, with the lack of controls, the banks are, you can't say the banks are facilitating this or supporting this or assisting them. But to be fair, to an extent, the facilitation is there because the controls are so lax.
Let's pick up on something you said. I mean, what are the challenges and strategies for investigating CSAM and human trafficking in both traditional and decentralized financial systems?
That's a really great question. That's a really, really good question, AJ. We all hear the stories, for example, the Mekong Club, Matthew Fieldman and his wife, they do fantastic work on raising awareness. And, Archandra Kotecha as well. She does amazing work on raising awareness on modern day slavery, on human trafficking, on sexual exploitation, and, trying to help victims. But your question is the fundamental question. So we're all aware, and everybody will talk to it. And I see multiple posts on LinkedIn in particular on a weekly basis about statistics on human trafficking and modern day slavery and CSAM, etc. Okay, it's absolutely horrendous. And each of the stories in their own right is absolutely heartbreaking. But what are the banks doing about the typologies to better identify it? How can we better identify it? And again, it goes back to our ability to detect. And this is all same in terms of the controls and the monitoring and the systems. The only way many banks currently have to identify changes in a bank account activity is either through the front end. When I say front end, fraud controls. Fraud controls happen pre-transaction authorization. So when you put through a transaction, if it hits a fraud alert control, the transaction will be stopped until it has been investigated. So that will stop the money leaving the bank. But the other controls that are generally applied are the transaction monitoring controls, which happen post-event, i.e. the money has already flown the nest. You're not getting that money back. And afterwards, based on rules and scenarios within the system and thresholds, different transactions will be picked up and will be investigated. And the challenge is what you're trying to understand is where changes in typologies have happened, where changes in the account activity have happened. And I'll give you a really good example, a human trafficking example that I actually worked on a number of years ago for a very large international bank. I was reviewing level 3 transaction monitoring alerts. So you have level 1 is when the alert is generated. Is it a potential positive hit? Then it's moved to level 2 where they do further investigation. And level 3 is, does this warrant an STR? And so it came to my desk and I was looking at this and I was like, okay, well, what's happened here? So we had, and the question from the reviewer at the level 2 was, this appears to make sense. And I was like, okay. So, but the reviewer said, but there's just something, it doesn't feel right, but can we ask your opinion on it? So when reviewing the alert, what had happened was we had a client of the bank who ran a beauty salon in let's say Hong Kong. And I don't want any stereotypes here. This is the typology of the exact example I worked on. And let's say ran a beauty salon in Hong Kong. And every month this individual was receiving a fixed amount of money from another individual who also banked with the same bank. And when the client was questioned about it, the client said, oh, I'm his mistress, and every month he's giving me this money. By the way, that's a plausible reason to close out an alert. and I've seen that in private banking. I see it in retail banking. I've seen it, and it happens. So it's like, okay, so this individual is receiving X amount every month from her lover, and are we okay to close that? And I've seen alerts closed out on that basis, because it is a justifiable basis for some of the alerts. Okay, so what do we do? And the individual said, well, look, it's every month she's receiving this money. Are we okay to close this out based on the rationale it's been given, or should we look at it further? And luckily, And I say, luckily, the individual that was sending the money to the lady also had a bank account with the same bank. So I asked, like, have we looked at their bank account? Oh, well, no, because this alert pertained to this individual. I said, well, okay, we can look through this transaction. How is this individual getting this money every month? What we then identified, and this is all done manually, what we then identified was that this individual was also receiving a fixed sum of money from, let's say, Japan on a monthly basis, which equaled, which basically, when you saw the push through, he was taking a 10% cut every month before he sent the money to the other lady. It turned out that it was a human trafficking ring. And in fact, the beauty salon was a front for sex workers. And obviously this was exploitation. And subsequently there was a whole investigation, etc. And I'm glad to say that we were part of being able to stop that human trafficking ring. But AJ, the question you asked me is, how are banks identifying these typologies? There you go. That's the answer. We are trying to get data from the enforcement bodies. We're trying to get data from STR alerts. We've also got a number of banks that are working together in conjunction with one another to try and share typologies. In Hong Kong, Paul Jeftovich, who's now back in Australia with Commonwealth Bank, he did an amazing job of bringing together, when he was at HSBC in Hong Kong as the head of financial crime for APAC, he did an amazing job of bringing together other banks at the time, Kenneth Pemberton at Standard Chartered, to name a few, brought everybody together so the banks could share not confidential data about clients, but typologies, so they could better understand the sophisticated networks that were working within that location. And this is where public-private partnerships, and I don't want to sound like, like I'm beating a drum here, but this is where public-private partnerships are so critical to supporting us in identifying typologies, because it's only through, let's say one bank says, hey, we identified this typology. Have you noticed this in your books? Then the other bank goes back, oh, actually, we've got that too. And then they begin to start sharing data. And it's like, okay, well, we saw this coming through our books. What have you seen? And that is where we're having to work together, because there's a lack of support from the public side in data sharing. It's getting better now. But what we've seen actually in Ireland this past couple of weeks was an initiative where the police officers are going in to work in the banks, and the bank officers are going in to work with the police, with the FIUs, so that everybody can get an understanding of what everybody's doing. So we can all say, actually, let's talk about innovation. How can we do this better? So I know I've said to kind of answer your question, that's how it's happening at the moment, AJ. That's the truth of how we're trying to identify these types of illicit activities. The crimes themselves are absolutely heinous. The consequences of the crimes are something, as a mother of 3 girls in particular with human trafficking and sexual exploitation and CSAM, it makes my blood boil, whilst at the same time makes me physically sick, because I can't imagine it happening to one of my children. But the truth is, what are the banks doing to really implement effective change and identify? Well, we all talk about it, and it's a bit like AI. We talk about these kind of key topics, and people will go to conferences, and we want to do more. What are we actually doing? There's slowly, we're starting to make credible change. Awareness is key. Again, it goes back to education. Do the individuals that are reviewing the transaction alerts understand the typologies? Many of these people are, we're bringing in really junior staff to review alerts. Are they really understanding the typologies? Are they really being able to look through the transactions? There is a massive gap in education. But again, it goes back to systems. If we begin to implement better systems using even a hybrid AI model, these systems can do a lot of that hard work for us. And then rather, the analysts who are more educated, if I may say that, we have educated, sophisticated analysts reviewing tangible results that have been produced from the system, as opposed to current day rules and scenario based threshold alerts, which are 2 to 8% accurate. And that goes back to the 101 of all of this. Like, the problem here is the perpetrators know that the control, they're, 9 times out of 10, I think that's even like that's a very fair stat, even more, they're not going to get caught.
It's clear that you have faith in the power of technology to solve such problems, or at the very least be part of the solution. I guess what I'm wondering is, what do you see as the hurdles, the difficulties, globally speaking, of using such technology and combating these crimes? Or, are there no challenges in using such technology? What are your thoughts? I guess I mean, the real question is what's holding them back. I remember years ago some bankers telling me, even when times were good, getting authorization to spend on technology upgrades was tough. So there's that. But do you see any other challenges in that regard?
Systems will never replace people. I think it's very, very important that we say that when we talk about and we talk about AI means many, many different things. Predictive analytics, NLP, neural language processing. There's so many different aspects. AI is an umbrella term for multiple different underlying use cases. And, if we had more time today, I would kind of go into all of the different use cases of AI within the control world and where we are. Predictive analytics, we're not there yet. We're far away from there. And that is where the system has learned and is able then to begin to start predicting themselves where they actually believe, or they see the potential activity is going to happen. At the moment, we're still at the stage of trying to identify the activity in our book and learning more about typologies. So systems will never replace people. The challenge with people is that we need better awareness, better education, better training. There is no substitution for on-the-job training. But if you're training on the job and you're not having, shall I say, additional training outside of that to continually understand evolutions in typologies and trends, what we're finding with many individuals is that transaction monitoring reviews, for example, is nothing more than a tick box exercise. When you're reviewing a transaction monitoring alert, you have to remember, or reviewing KYC files or anything, every client is niche to itself. This can never be, what aspects of KYC can be tick box? Obtaining corporate documentation, tick box. It's right. We need the memorandum of association. We need the articles of incorporation. We need the company registration details, the company number. We need the certificate of good standing, all of this information. We need a list of, authorized signatories, you name it. But, we need to know who has the power of attorney. We need various information on the directors. So for screening, who are the main shareholders? So all of this information, this is 101. Tick, tick, tick. We've got that all. Then you need to analyze that information. You need to subjectively and objectively review it and understand, okay, well, this is the information we have. This is the screening that's been performed against XYZ. What does that tell me? If we've got a complex, business, have I drafted out an organizational chart? How does this organization work? Who are the relevant people? How are they connected? Do I understand the various levels within the organization? Is it a complex organization? Do I really know who the key investors are? Is there levels where potentially there could be money coming in, but I don't see where it's coming from because it's through different corporate structures? So that's the 101. But you need to subjectively analyze this. And this is where we need really good training with our people. You can't put a junior on this. You need somebody that understands corporate structures. Charities is a great example. That's the 101 now for for moving monies for terrorism, is predominantly legal arrangements. So whether it's your trust, your foundation, your charity. And why is that? Because not many people understand the complexity of the structure of these entities. And because of the way in which they have money coming into their business through obviously donations, etc., it's a very, very easy conduit to move money. But I won't even go down the route of terrorist financing. You should never, ever couple together money laundering and terrorist financing as typologies, because they are two completely separate typologies. One is illicit activity where they're engineering controls to clean money. The other one is basically, I suppose you could call it reverse money laundering to an extent. You're taking clean money, donations from people like you and I who believe in a cause, not saying that we're giving money to terrorist organizations, but just as an example, terrorist organizations, most of their donations is from completely legitimate sources. But what they then need to do is they then need to use that money to basically to support the operations of the organization. And that's where they're having to then move the money to pay for these, whether it's on the dark web or etc., to buy arms, to fund, travel tickets, you name it, invest in their training. So they're two very different typologies, but we need much more training and awareness and understanding. And then on the transaction monitoring side, yes, we can implement all these systems which can better identify potential activity, but again, we need somebody looking at it and analyzing and subjectively understanding whether or not it makes sense and asking the right questions. The example I gave you was a very simple example. But again, it just shows you, it's like, well, this rationale given by the client appears to be plausible. The relationship manager is happy enough with that. Can we close this alert out? And that's the question you're asking yourself. And interestingly, there was about 10 years ago, goodness me, 10 years ago now, there was an enforcement action taken against, I don't know if this is public, so I won't give the name of the bank, in Singapore. And the enforcement action was taken by the MAS for the very reason, and the MAS was absolutely correct in what they said. The alert was closed out too soon. And if somebody had just asked the right question, they would have uncovered this illicit activity. But that's the challenge here, AJ. It is, where does our questioning need? At some point, you need to have comfort and you need to move on. As I mentioned, a lot of these alerts, we have daily KPIs for closure. So you have and by the way, these analysts, if they don't meet their KPIs, they lose their jobs. Okay, so you're telling me I need to close out at least 10 alerts a day. If I don't close it out, I can lose my job or I don't get my bonus. I'm going to make damn well sure that I close out my alerts.
Yeah, and that
so
leads to them being overzealous.
Exactly. We've got a perfect storm brewing, and it is an absolute storm that is a breeding ground for illicit activity, because in essence, we're not doing enough to prevent it or stop it. And with backlogs, and some banks have transaction monitoring backlogs of 50 to 100,000 alerts. You need to close out those alerts within a period of time. Banks then throw money at those closures. But guess what? The system is still churning out garbage because the system needs to be recalibrated. It is like trying to hold back a tide, AJ. And that is where banks such as HSBC have said, look, enough is enough. This is never going to be sustainable. It's an absolute, we're just bleeding money. And for what? Let's implement the right systems. And what HSBC have done with the AI Google is phenomenal. It's a game changer, and hats off to them for it. But, we could say that they have the luxury of, they're a tier one bank. They have the pockets for it. Other banks don't, but the truth is money laundering activities are happening through tier one, tier two, tier three banks, in particular retail accounts, because it's just such a mass business that they haven't got the focus on it.
Part of covering this field for as long as I have, and I mean, probably about 17, going on 18 years now since I started my career as a financial legal journalist. And from the start, my focus was AML. Now, I always thought the difference between AML and CTF was, with money laundering, it's the same parties typically, with and the payments are periodic transfers. Terrorist financing, it could be the same parties, it could not be. terrorist financing can be done with very small amounts,
Hmm.
and it could be periodic, or it may well just be one-off occurrences or sporadic instances. So there is that to keep in mind. But a common thread that's been visible all throughout my career, and you know, you drew attention to it several times today in our chat, that is the banks shirking their responsibility. So let's look at trade-based money laundering, which isn't going away. People have said to the banks, well, you can't just look at the money laundering aspect of it. You can't just look at the paperwork. You also got to look at what's going on in warehouses. And trade-based money laundering suggests vessels, ships. You've also got to look at the manifest. Did vessel A actually reach a particular port? And did it offload everything that its manifest said it was supposed to? Their attitude is that
Sorry.
that's not our responsibility. I think that's a cop out, but that's just me.
Yeah, I think that, I don't want to sit here and sound like I'm kind of berating the banks because that's not what this is about. But, you have to take accountability where accountability is due. And in my opinion, in respect of the banks, they do have a duty of care. If you look at the 101 principles, what is a bank's obligation? One, it is to protect the financial integrity of the market, and two, to put customers first. Those are the those are the 101s of the banks. And from what we've been talking about today, my concern is A, the integrity of the market is not being protected, and B, the customers' interests are not being put first. And that so we have to go back to basics here. Are the banks doing what they're supposed to do, what it says on the tin? And the answer from the logic that I just presented is no, they're not. And how are we going to create? Is it even possible to create change? And I've never wanted to be one of those people that kind of makes it my mission to stand on a soapbox and say, all bank, I don't want this to be an Animal Farm situation. All banks are bad, but some banks are better than others. But I think that's the truth of the matter here. It is there are some banks that are making credible change and change. I've mentioned Westpac. I'm really impressed with what I've seen these past few weeks with detection of fraud before the monies have left the account. It's been in the press. And credit to them because they've suffered negatively with enforcement action over the years. Um, I'm really proud of what HSBC, if I may say, of what they've done with the AI implementation, and I can see what a credible change that's making. I want to see more being done by other institutions. I want to see, they're all fixated on, I don't want my client to use their credit card or to transfer money to a crypto platform. And we're going to block our cards being used for crypto investments and, all of this. Seriously, that's your biggest concern right now? Crypto, as we've all seen, I remember back in 2015 where, I was in a meeting with the MAS and they said, it's not a financial product and we don't regulate it. And they were absolutely right. They didn't then. Now it's a different state of affairs. It's a crypto product and we need to get with the evolving product landscape. But the biggest concern banks have at the moment, it's not about the diversification of products and the risks present themselves. As I said, all financial products carry risks, some more than others. And with crypto, we need to really break down the utility use cases of various tokens and what they can be used for, etc. And differentiate between privacy coins and other traceable coins because blockchain analytics is just phenomenal. This is one of the important points, AJ, where we have victims that have been victims because, and it's involved crypto, our ability to trace the assets, it's through blockchain analytics. It's amazing. It's the fiat transactions that are the challenge here. Like once your fiat, your dollar leaves your bank account, it's gone. But once your crypto, let's say your Bitcoin leaves your account, it's traceable with blockchain analytics unless it's gone through multiple mixers to kind of to break the chain, so to speak. And even then, with the increase in sophistication of blockchain analytics day in, day out, it's incredible what we're seeing in terms of traceability. And we're even being able, look at Mount Go. We were able to, 5, 6 years later, get back, I think, approximately 75, 80% of the Bitcoin that have been stolen and return them to the original owners. So amazing advancements are being made in the crypto space to be able to trace and identify the movement of tokens, of assets across the blockchain. What an ownership. What we're not seeing is obviously we don't have that functionality in Fate, and yet the controls that we're having to implement in Fate to identify illicit activity are indeed a precursor to it, to identifying it before it happens. They're just not there.
But don't we have to acknowledge that a big part of what's holding financial institutions writ large from adopting AI, it isn't so much the cost, but the concern that I am going to feed my proprietary information into this machine, into this contraption. Who's paying attention on the other end? And is it safe? And will this come back to haunt me?
Well, JP Morgan just rolled out their chatbot. It was this week or last, I think it was this week, where they've implemented kind of an AI chatbot, which they feed all of their research and materials and everything into. Again, research, this is published, so it's in the public domain. You know as well as I do, the immediate, as soon as it's published, that's there. It's there. We don't really need a cooling off period. But they've actually implemented an AI chatbot, and this is. One of the things that I've been working on actually is the creation of an AI compliance assistant. We are, and if you think about kind of proprietary information, this is not about customer information, but this is where we basically upload all of our policies and procedures into the cloud. We then start to work with the AI tool, asking it questions about the policies so that it can actually act as a kind of an advisor. Well, I say an advisor, it can advise on policy within the organization. We're not at a stage yet where it can take regulatory changes and, adapt the policies. That's further down the line. But at this moment in time, you can go in and you can ask the chatbot, hey, can you tell me what is our limit on, gifts and entertainment, just simple things. And it can respond. You can also say, hey, could you please provide me with a quick overview or quick training on what our obligations are in respect of, recording meetings with clients or something. And that this chatbot will actually just do a very, very simple, quick, as long as you just do it short or, write a 2 paragraphs, it will produce that, in inverted commas, training for every employee in the bank. So we're going to move away from the standardized compliance training that we have and more to bespoke training that suits the individual's capacity and what they need to do in their role through this virtual AI assistant. And that is where AI is going to be so, so supportive within organizations. We're not going to be feeding it, obviously, when we're looking at client data. Yes, you're right, in the question of how well do we understand the tools in terms of the information that's going into it? Have we got the right controls in the background to prevent, cyber attacks, access to, to the systems where somebody could perpetrate the bank's, hardware and be able to obtain this information? That's just an ongoing cybersecurity challenge, which all banks are facing. But what are the biggest risks right now? The biggest risks, I think, is banks sitting back and waiting to see what the rest of the market does before they start to do stuff themselves. That's a good play in terms of product implementation. If we look at the 2007 kind of crash, the firms that kind of stepped back and kind of took a dinosaur approach to, CDFs and CDS, they didn't really get hit as bad. But in the age of AI, if these banks don't begin to update their technology, invest in technology and clean up their data and clean up their systems and look more holistically at risk controls, they're going to be bleeding money. B, enforcement action is around the corner, which is going to cost them money. C, there are ways in which we can have competitive advantages from implementing these systems. We can actually, in theory, predict changes in our clients' lifestyle. We can support the customer journey through their life. We can front run their need for products and support the client. So when we're looking at AI implementation, we need to look at this holistically. By profiling the customer, we're actually going to be able to better serve the customer, if that makes sense. And then compliance will always be a cost, and compliance isn't the right word. Mitigating risk will always be a cost within organizations, but we're going to be able to do it so much more strategically, and we're going to be able to do it much more effectively in terms of cost and resources, because the systems are not going to be spewing out garbage. They're going to be spewing out tangible information, which we're then going to be able to better upskill our systems in terms of their understanding of typologies with as well. So I see this as a win-win. The firms that are not currently implementing these systems, they're going to suffer as a result of it. And in the longer term, and I say longer term, we're talking 5 to 6 to 7 years.
Well, I guess on the AI front, time will tell. I concur with your point about these being heinous crimes, and sadly, from what I've seen on the human trafficking front, Oonagh, many of these victims will never be whole. I'm speaking to cops and intelligence and military types that have seen far worse than myself because they've been directly involved in rescue efforts. And it gives you some indication of what a bleak and evil world we sometimes live in. But looking ahead to what you're doing, I want to end on a positive note, and I want to read something from your most recent LinkedIn post, where you say why this matters. Financial scams leave lasting impacts and are destroying lives with little to no help available. Recovery can feel overwhelming. By joining forces, we aim to turn the tide and provide the help and guidance victims need to reclaim their financial futures. And that's huge, because for many of these human trafficking victims, or even sex abuse victims, getting them back into the daily groove of living their lives and being productive members of society, and working towards their financial futures and earning a living can be a challenge after the trauma that they've suffered. So I think anything you can do in that regard is certainly a noble work, and work worth doing. In the time we've got left, is there anything you'd like to say? Anything you feel we didn't cover? I think we covered a fair amount of ground, and this is an ongoing discussion.
Yeah, I said it. I think we've covered literally so many different topics, which we could have gone down rabbit holes on. No, I think I'll just go back to kind of the basics on it. Firstly, thank you very, very much for the opportunity to talk about these issues today. I don't want to sound like I'm some kind of, it's all the banks. As I said earlier, this is all because of the banks. That's not the case. The banks have a duty of care here, but also individuals have an obligation to be educated and to ensure that they're aware. That is what the challenge is here. There's a real lack of public awareness campaigns in various areas, whether it's pig butchering. There's a lady, Erin West, in the US, who's been doing amazing work globally on going around raising awareness on pig butchering scams. Like, she's taken that upon herself because she's seen the consequences in the US, and the detrimental consequences of the impact that these scams have. So, what we need to see more of is we need to see more I went to a very good example. I went to the British government with a petition saying that we should be teaching, financial literacy in schools, which also includes being able to identify illicit activity, because children are being targeted through TikTok videos, through Instagram, through social media. And the response I got from the British government was, education is devolved in the UK. So if you want to do something, you need to go to your local education board. I'm sorry, but we've got children committing suicide because of sextortion crimes. And you're telling me that it is not your responsibility as a government to put out a simple awareness campaign, to buy some airtime on, a billboard or a TV or a radio. You're telling me that it's local education board's responsibility to do this. And, then you go back to the local education board and you go to the local police force, and credit where credit's due. In Scotland and in Northern Ireland, the police have been investing resources into awareness campaigns, but it's not being seen enough. And they're doing their absolute best, and I take my hat off to them. But where are the governments in this? We need much more education. And that's just we're talking children here. On the other flip side, we have vulnerable people who have paid their taxes their entire lives, have been upstanding citizens of the community, who now have had their pension funds wiped out because of these crimes. We owe them a duty of care. So I expect a lot more to be done at a government level across the board. I expect a lot more to be done on awareness campaigns by the banks, so making sure that they're educating their customers as well. And I don't mean just like an email here and there. I mean real tangible, but whatever works, especially with elderly people, not many of them are on social media. So how do we get the message to them? What is the best medium? And that's what I want to see more of. I want to see more awareness, more education. We're doing what we can do, through Raw Compliance. We're creating training videos, which have been shared across many schools in the UK, in Scotland and in England. I'm very, very privileged to be part of a female entrepreneur network in the UK, which my sister brought me in on. And this is some of the top 50 most successful female entrepreneurs in the UK running multi-million-dollar businesses. And I'm sharing these materials with them, and they're then sending it out into their networks. And that's how we're having to do this. And that's not the way optimally this should be done. I know in the UK, for example, Ofcom will be introducing some new regulations this year about social media and age restrictions. As we all know, people can circumvent age restrictions on any social media platforms. So my question is, how is this going to be materially a deterrent to this activity? It's not going to be. And children will always find a way to circumvent these controls. So a lot needs to be. Social media platforms play a role here. Facebook, so Meta, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, they're all WhatsApp. I have got a number of messages on WhatsApp suddenly been added to a group offering me money if I will like some Instagram posts or YouTube posts, and then they're going to send me money to my bank account. I just need to send them my bank account details, and then they're going to send me €5. And then they kind of reach out and say, oh, would you like to work with us to do more likes and more posts? And we need to transfer some money. And then these children and their children are people who are in financial difficulty are becoming complicit in illicit activity. And what's going to happen? They could end up going to prison. So awareness is key. Social media platforms, government agencies, schools, banks, we all play a role. And I really, really wish we could see more being done in this space, because frankly, not enough is being done. I don't have all the answers. I'm doing my bit, but I want everybody else to step up and do their bit and become accountable so that we can affect real change and help prevent some lives being lost as a result of all of this.
Well put. And I wish you much luck in that endeavor.
Thank you.
Oonagh Vanden, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, AJ. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
And to our listeners, thank you again. Until next time.